welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine, and I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Terri Friedline. She is an associate professor of social work at the University of Michigan. She's the author of the book, Banking on a Revolution: Why Financial Technology Won't Save a Broken System, available from Oxford University Press. But even more importantly, she's a contributor to the wonderful Current Affairs magazine, where you may have read the most recent piece she wrote for us is The Day Wells Fargo Closed, a rather remarkable piece of utopian fiction about the day Wells Fargo closed. Professor Terri Friedline, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Well, hi, Nathan. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, we got to talk about the day Wells Fargo closed. This is one of the most unique pieces that we've published in Current Affairs. And I suppose instead of me describing, maybe you could describe the core premise and just summarize this piece for our listening audience.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Wells Fargo, of course, is not officially closed, but I wanted to help people imagine the day when it could be or would be closed. A lot of the teaching and the research that I do has to do around big systems. So racial capitalism, banking, finance, white supremacy, and a struggle sometimes to think about how those systems get dismantled, like as we simultaneously build out new things that we want to see for like a more collective sort of solidarity, kind of the future that we want to have. What does it look like to take pieces of the institutions that are harmful now and wind them down and then build out new ones? And so I wanted to imagine that for Wells Fargo. Of course, it is a bank that has been in the news quite a lot. Also, to be clear, I don't think this is a story unique, like particularly unique to Wells Fargo. I think many banks and insurance companies share a similar sort of origin story that's like rooted in chattel slavery, rooted in Jim Crow and indigenous genocide, as Wells Fargo is. Bank kind of gets its start, the gold rush. As part of that Western expansion, indigenous tribes were displaced. Some numbers put around 100,000 peoples were killed, and the bank gets started and kind of capitalizes on the gold rush. And this is a history that many banks share. Mm-hmm. So the piece kind of tells the story realistically, like goes through the actual accurate history of the bank. And then at some point, like takes a turn.
Right, where we're in the future.
Into the fiction part, and like with inspiration from like science fiction and Afrofuturism, then imagines the present day closure of the bank.
Yeah. What you said is, I think very true, which is that we often end up talking in kind of abstractions, about systems of power and, the need for transformation and justice. But we live in the real world. We live in a world of very, practical in reality. And here we need to think about, well, okay, what are we talking about? How would we apply? What would justice look like? What would a transformation of the banking system look like? And so what you do in this piece is you nicely take us into the future and you go, okay, well, if we were to wind down and eliminate Wells Fargo, what would that look like? How would it happen? What would be the sort of legal structure here? Where would the money go? What would the role of the FDIC be? And it helps to make it sort of more real in the mind of the reader.
Yeah, I mean, banks actually are required by regulation to like write out standard operating procedures for the case in which they fail. So there's, documentation somewhere, actually, if Wells Fargo were to be closed or would need to be wound down by regulators, there's a binder somewhere, somebody has like the bank has like typed out the instructions on, what it would look like for the bank to close. That exists. And there are like policies and procedures, which sometimes can sound boring and mundane, but those are the tools and strategies that I think we can use that like exist and we can pull on and we can leverage, shift power to scale down the institutions that are, harming us and the planet kind of every day and make it feel practical and possible envision that future that we want to see.
Yes, I know a bank can be ended because my personal bank, First Republic Bank, has just ended and been but it has been taken over by JP Morgan Chase. What you point out in this piece is that that is not the only option for a bank, is just to have it, be absorbed, merged into some other existing bank. We can envision, because you don't just talk about ending Wells Fargo, you're talking about trying to change the way that banking operates. So tell us, if we do get the binder out for Wells Fargo and follow the procedure, what is the alternative to Wells Fargo? What takes the place of Wells Fargo?
Well, what takes the place, I think, in the piece is a community-driven sort of vision for what happens to the physical bank branches that like Wells Fargo leaves behind. I mean, some of the really great artwork that was done for the piece, and part of what Current Affairs published was like envisioning gardens coming out of the ATMs and, plants and like foliage, kind of nature reclaiming the brick and mortar. There's something recently, actually, with the recent bank crises that I haven't followed up completely on, but one of the things that I mentioned in the Wells Fargo piece is that Congress can pass like a one-time least cost sort of resolution for the closing of the bank, which is part of the rationale for what regulators have done in some of the recent failures, is like draw upon that least cost resolution of a bank in some sort of way. So that is a way that closing a bank, that is part of the practice of closing a bank. And in the most recent cases, First Republic and banks in Silicon Valley, that was like uniquely called upon. But in the case of Wells Fargo, to resolve the bank, I am suggesting that, Congress can use that least cost resolution to turn over the branches and the physical infrastructure of the bank to communities for them to use, kind of as they need. And in some cases, maybe that's public banking, and public banking is kind of a bank for the people and being a step toward kind of transparent budgeting and financing and putting money back into the communities for the things that they need. In other cases, people are using those bank branches for daycares and community spaces and thinking about places where communities might need to respond to climate disasters and emergencies. Maybe the bank branch serves as like a place for that.
To dwell on public banking a little bit, because I think this is this kind of important alternative. We don't have to have giant corporate banks trying to squeeze every last penny out of communities. We can have communities control their own banking. There are a couple of cities now that have taken steps towards establishing public banks. I looked up, you cite the example of Philadelphia, and I looked up where the status of the Philadelphia public bank is. And unfortunately, the mayor has just put a stop to the Philadelphia Public Bank for the moment. But there's a public campaign to push, and I think it passed the city council to get a public bank. LA is moving forward with a public banking proposal. So we are starting to imagine these possibilities for a world where we don't just have a choice between Wells Fargo and JP Morgan.
And to give some context, depending on how you look at the numbers, there are about 34 or 35 public banking coalitions or, kind of movements of various sizes working towards public banking in cities and states around the United States. And so this is a bank that is intended to be publicly owned, transparently operated, and to use public monies from things like tax revenues, public pension funds, teachers' pensions, some of which have been wrapped up in like cryptocurrency losses and Signature Valley Bank failures over the last couple of months. And so those are public monies that could be put into a public bank where the profits from those investments get returned into the local communities and the people, where they're like originally generated. So Philadelphia, yes, has an active campaign, and they've, been working for maybe 3 or 5 years. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, New York, just in my view is really exciting work doing the practice of envisioning what else is possible kind of in the financial system. Like you said, like we don't have to rely on Wells Fargo or JP Morgan for all of our banking needs. We can like kind of imagine some of these alternatives. Interestingly, like the mayor, the city council in Philadelphia did vote to approve their public financing authority. And so that coalition had like broad support from the city council. The mayor squashed it, but they're in an election campaign this year. And so the coalition has been really working to do popular political education in the city to help people learn about what a public bank is, and are mayoral candidates supportive of a public bank. That's part of their work now, so that for their election, which I think is in November, maybe they can put that issue of public banking literally back on the ballot with that election.
This is one of the reasons I always try and tell people why we need independent media organizations, work as an independent media organization. And from your piece in Current Affairs, as I started to, so interested in what you mentioned, this Philadelphia thing, started reading about it, then going, oh, this is totally fascinating. They're doing incredible work. Why have I never read about this anywhere? Why has nobody covered? Why is this not in the news? Where is the news? One thing I've realized over the course of interviewing lots of activists and academics and journalists is that there's so much incredible work being done in communities that never gets reported outside of those communities that can offer models and inspire the rest of us.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Next City is a publication that's done a good bit of reporting consistently on public banking and on the possibilities that people in communities are pushing to the table, constructing new tables as they do their work. But now is a time where conversation on public banking, I think, has picked up quite a bit. And it's a little bit hard if you're in the vacuum to kind of understand exactly kind of how widespread the idea is. Over the last month or two, I've been interviewing folks in Chicago about the idea of public banking. And Chicago is not a place that has a very large coalition of folks. They have also just had a mayoral election and an elected Brandon Johnson, who has a fairly sort of politically progressive platform, but does not necessarily have public banking on his platform, or at least, hasn't explicitly stated it as of yet. But over this time have happened to be talking to folks in Chicago about the idea of public banking. And everyone is very aware of bank failures nowadays. They are very aware that any existing banks kind of in their communities are not there for them, and are really ready in their conversations to can you sign me up today for that public bank? Can you open it now, and can it exist? Can it hurry up and exist? Because this system is not working. And so it does feel like we're in a time when people are interested in and receptive to public banking in a way that maybe they weren't this time last year.
Right. Things move fast. You mentioned, some of the early history of Wells Fargo in particular. I do want to talk about, because in your piece, you go through some of the contemporary problems that in your piece create the discontent that leads to the ultimate winding down of Wells Fargo. When I was doing the page layouts for your piece, I went on the Associated Press to get pictures, because I'm always looking for some photography that can accompany a piece. And I looked up, I thought, okay, well, if someone's had a protest against Wells Fargo, maybe I can get a picture. And when you look through the AP News database, it's dozens and dozens of protests in various cities on various issues have been held against Wells Fargo. This is a bank in particular, and I take it this is why you picked this particular bank to be the subject of the piece, that has done a lot wrong.
Yes. I mean, I did kind of describe some of the history, the 1800s gold rush, all the way up through just last month. There were protests against, the funding, banks' financing of fossil fuels and kind of underwriting climate destruction, and protests at Wells Fargo, branches and headquarters around climate-related issues. So just last month. And it is a bank, that in the time leading up to the Great Recession, so 2007, 2009, was engaged in subprime lending, exploiting and targeting, Black and brown borrowers in particular, who would have qualified for loans on better terms, still selling them, these high interest kind of subprime mortgages. It absorbed some of the banks that failed during the Great Recession, picked up, pieces of banks that, kind of added to the complications, I suppose, of a bank that was already having a number of problems. Pressured its employees with sales quotas, which is not something that just Wells Fargo has done, but is, I think, kind of widespread throughout the banking industry. So keeping their employees like jobs and paychecks associated with how many bank accounts or credit cards that they sell. And that sort of pressure contributed to an environment where, Wells Fargo employees were opening accounts for customers that didn't know that they had them and then charging them fees. If you have an account that you don't know exists, you're not using it, so it might be inactive, you get maintenance fees. And so that was a scandal that emerged shortly after the Great Recession, 2011, 2013. Of course, that's like also right after Occupy Wall Street, and just has had a series of scandals like in the last 15 years that have, really heightened people's awareness to this bank in particular as one that's like problematic and predatory. And I think that also maybe has given some other banks like some shielding or some, protection from their own scrutiny, but has made like Wells Fargo a particularly kind of obvious villain, I guess, in this story of banking.
Right. But as you have said, ultimately we're talking about problems with the banking system. Our listeners might remember that a few months ago we had Elena Botella on, who is the author of Delinquent, who worked at Capital One. She was talking about credit cards and all of the various ways in which people are enticed, and that she saw at Capital One, to take out credit cards that obviously are bad for them. I want to turn to the subject of your book. Your book is obviously about the banking system and alternatives, but the subtitle of your book, Why Financial Technology Won't Save a Broken System. You've told us a little bit there about the brokenness of the system, but let's talk about the false promise of financial technology in particular and why you chose to make that a centerpiece of your book.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, basically, I wanted to push back on just the really, really like pervasive and invasive, I guess, idea that digital technology is like a one-stop solution to all of our like social problems and challenges. I mean, especially in banking and finance, where like the histories and the legacies of power and oppression are just so deeply rooted. And I happened to be, some of the background in me writing the book, which I began kind of thinking about in 2014, 2015, is that I was sitting in all these meetings in DC, these like policy convenings, kind of think tank conversations, special task forces that were like designed with the supposed purpose of helping people get access to financial products and services. So bank the unbanked and that sort of conversation.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
Yeah. And regardless of whether we like it or not, it's really like almost necessary in today's sort of capitalist economy to have a bank account. You're a good citizen if you have debt, right? Citizen in quotes. And there was this idea, in the shadow of like the Great Recession, where like people lost a lot of money. Poor people lost a lot of money during that time. People were very precarious. Lending shrank. Banks stopped kind of making loans. And in these conversations and these policy conversations, the idea was, well, there's this new banking app or this new smartphone. Like these kind of digital technologies were just going to solve the problems that have been so deeply rooted in the history of like what we've come to know as the United States. And I was just kind of struggling with this cognitive dissonance. What I realize now is that, maybe I was misunderstanding these policy conversations, or I wasn't quite getting, what was happening here, because it didn't really...
It must be something else to this.
Yeah, because it didn't really feel to me like, if you are a single mom who is like burning your dirty diaper, your kids' dirty diapers in the cold of winter, when the heat goes out, so that you are warm enough to kind of survive the cold. I do not understand how this banking app is going to resolve those issues, and that it's like, or if you live in an area where there's no satellite reception or there's no high-speed internet, how these technological tools are going to solve The problems that people have that are really about the lack of like real material resources and just the lack of any sort of caring or generosity that our policy infrastructure has for people who are struggling. Like a new bank account app is not necessarily going to help a trans person whose IDs might not match in the process of getting access to their money. Like just so that is the context from which I began thinking about and writing this book and really wanting to address what I saw as like, power in banking and finance playing a significant role, and that any new technologies are a reinforcement of that power, not a correction of it.
And I don't think you have, in your answer there, said the words cryptocurrency, but they certainly came to mind for me, which is that there are things that are presented as solutions, the techno solutions, that actively harm and exploit people. And I always think back to, and I think we played on the program when we interviewed Molly White, the Spike Lee cryptocurrency ad where he talks about how, he's been pitching a black audience on how the alternative to the US dollar is going to be liberatory. And I think there's so many ways to cast things that do nothing to shift the balance of wealth and power as solutions, as empowering. And, cryptocurrency, this is, I think you published your book before the big crypto crash, but a lot of people were told, free yourself from the banks. And because everyone wants to free themselves from the banks, they go, oh, well, this is a democratic finance. This is decentralized finance. And then they lose all their money because the crypto crashes.
Yeah. I mean, that is a predatory scheme, not unlike payday lenders and check cashers, not unlike how banks targeted Black and brown communities for subprime loans. I mean, it's just kind of an extension of that exploitation and of the predatory practices. I mean, there's been a good bit, I think, written about like that, the libertarian kind of impulses in crypto and the influences in crypto and how that has been used kind of worldwide as a way to funnel money and resources, in some cases, to like white supremacist and fascist organizations and efforts. And so crypto is like a banking account app or, like some of the other fintech promises. I mean, crypto is another one of those that, promises a solution, still trying to find the problem for which it is a solution. And of course, doing a lot of harm along the way. It's not in the book, but one of the things some colleagues and I have just done is we've done some qualitative research on fintech companies, newswires, and press releases over the last 30 years. So we've looked, over the last 30 years, which includes crypto companies, crypto exchanges. It includes like a whole range of stuff, Amazon, Facebook, and their lending, their digital currencies, and how they market and advertise those services, and the language that they use that disguises the ways that they're really trying to be predatory and exploitative. So promises of like protecting your money against fraud in countries in Africa where they will promise things like this will help you kind of manage your money, just to give us your fingerprint and, just kind of add this very personal information into our technology, and we will use it to protect you, while at the same time kind of collecting all of this information on people that they can then just use to turn around and exploit people for more money down the road or in other sorts of ways, or at least kind of have the potential to make their lives a little bit more precarious. And crypto is definitely wrapped up in that.
My favorite or least favorite is the clever euphemism of overdraft protection. We read an article a couple of years ago about how banks will tell you, oh, we offer you overdraft protection, which means that you'll be protected. But what it actually means is you'll be charged a giant fee if you go overdrawn.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the average overdraft is about $4 or $5, and the fee associated with that is about $35. An interest rate that even rivals the payday lenders.
And it fools people because you think it's the opposite of what it is. You think it's, oh, if I get the protection, I won't have to pay the fee. But it's actually, no, if you get the protection is you can go overdrawn for a fee rather than us just declining the transaction. And it's billions of dollars they make just in overdraft fee.
Yes. And, during the pandemic, that was like a thing that banks were selling. So colleagues and I interviewed bank employees like throughout the, early months of the pandemic. And they were talking about, well, you need to make rent, you need to pay your groceries, you're kind of in an emergency, just overdraft. I mean, if you overdraft, that's a way to get money. You need to get money, you don't have a paycheck. And they were really selling it. And we also know that, banks, whenever kind of stimulus payments came in and people were able to, receive some of the stimulus checks from the government, that when that money came into a bank account, banks were able to take those overdraft fees off the top. So if you were expecting a certain amount in your, stimulus paycheck, banks siphon that money, that overdraft fee off first. And that is just consistent with the ways that they will always kind of flip and manipulate the system to get the money that they need.
Mm-hmm. One of the chapters in your book that I think is really interesting is when you talk about financial literacy education and the way in which there's all of this propaganda about how everyone needs to be responsible with managing their money. You need to learn how to manage your money. And you need to learn budgeting, and you need to learn to live within your means. And what we should do is we should give people this financial literacy. And you point out that in many ways there is a kind of implicit shifting of like who is responsible for someone's poverty.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite chapters to write, actually. I am a social worker, by kind of background and training. And so social workers generally like work with people and individuals as a way of like more broadly kind of understanding systems and the environment in which people live. And so there are a lot of social workers that do financial education and financial coaching and budgeting and tax preparation work. So it feels kind of familiar, I suppose, in those ways professionally, and is so much of how we sell kind of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of approach. If you just learn your budgeting a little bit better, if you just X, Y, and Z, your credit score will move up, 20 points. All these sort of like tips and tricks to what is really, I think, helping people like to acquiesce with the violence of racial capitalism and make them conform to systems that are just so punishing and exacting. And so like part of what this chapter says is financial education is not it, but part of what I've been learning, I guess, through writing that chapter and then just thinking about it subsequently since the book has come out is that popular political education around banking and finance is really important. So not the part about budgeting, but how is the credit scoring system trying to screw individuals over? How are medical bills so consistently wrong? All of the ways that the system is designed to operate, and we are so often socialized not to observe it or not to critique it. That sort of popular or political education around finance, I think, is critical for us to be able to know how systems are operating, to be able to observe their levers, and to work on like pushing and pulling them so that we can kind of change then the ways that these systems are operating.
Mm-hmm.
So unions often have like political education, popular education campaigns that, are related to healthcare access and wages. The Black Panthers had a really robust sort of popular political education program. Black cooperatives have had, good and robust education and training around money and finance. So I think that's a place where we maybe cannot completely throw out financial education, but co-opt it for this different purpose.
You point out in that chapter that it's not that financial education is completely ineffective necessarily, because there is some research to suggest that someone who works with a financial coach will in fact say have more savings. But I feel like there is this, as I say, this kind of burden shifting where it's like, if we say, okay, well, look, if you work with a financial coach, you'd have more savings. It's like, well, the people who didn't were irresponsible. But actually, I mean, I could save money on food by starving myself. I'm not surprised to hear that if someone's telling you, oh, don't spend money on all of these different things, you end up with more money at the end. But the question is it fair? Is it reasonable? Are we putting someone through something that they should have to go through? Or do we have a larger, maybe given the resources they have, they can learn how to avoid going broke quite as fast. But it needs to be grounded in a broader critique that asks, well, why are they in this situation in the first place where they're having to pinch every penny?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think, people have like real material resources or real material needs that they need to have met today. They need like resources to address today. And so, maybe it is about saving $50 extra or like finding a little bit here and there to get the thing that they need to be able to survive a little bit longer. But that is just keeping people kind of in a mode of survival and does place, a burden on individuals to kind of figure it out themselves. And also to add to that, I think a lot of financial education is done in the service of saying this will solve poverty. Slightly facetious. Take this financial education course and you will be out of poverty. And I think that is like so often the takeaway message. And so it is like giving somebody an individual solution to a structural problem rooted in who has and who doesn't, and who is advantaged by our existing systems. And I think we really need to learn how to change those systems. I suppose it's okay for today if you need to help somebody, get what they need to survive today. Like, absolutely cannot stop there. That we have to push the systems to be different so that everything we do as individuals is just not so consequential.
Right. And what I like about your book and your Wells Fargo article for Current Affairs is that, you get us thinking, well, what would it look like if we did things differently? And with that financial education piece, it started to think. I was like, well, okay, what is the knowledge that people really do need? And I was like, well, one thing is like, I thought about the fact that my mom is like a world-class expert in how to argue with a corporation to get them to give your money back when they've done something wrong. So she just got $700 out of Amazon who had, screwed something up. She's really good at she's like, I'm going to take it to the top and I'm going to get my money back. And these skills that how to deal with your bank, how to deal with your insurance company when they deny your claim. I feel like real education about economics and finance would necessarily take a kind of antagonistic stance towards these large institutions that are trying to siphon all of your wealth all the time.
Yeah, the Debt Collective has a really great book. It's called the Debt Resisters Operations Manual. And it goes through auto debt and student loan debt and credit card debt, and is about this very thing that you're suggesting is, okay, I have this problem. How do I go to that institution and how do I complain about that charge that's wrong on my credit card? Or how do I get the hospital to remove the error on the medical bill? That they have some really practical steps kind of in that work linked with the broader idea of debt cancellation, right? That like debt as injustice. And so not just the idea that people need to be able to, battle Amazon for their $700 back, but also then link that with, okay, what do we do about Amazon? That is social media and storefront and bank lender kind of all wrapped up into one. Internet service provider.
Right, increasingly everything. Yeah, so, we've dwelt on just one of the chapters in your book. Sadly, we don't have time to go through all of it, but that's why people should pick up the book today, Banking on a Revolution, Why Financial Technology Won't Save a Broken System. And then they should also go to Current Affairs. We will link in the show notes your wonderful piece on Wells Fargo, the day Wells Fargo closed. far or maybe near in the future. And just before we conclude, you are working on another piece for Current Affairs at the moment that I believe you just finished a draft of. Maybe you could tell us what's coming up.
I'd love to. The piece that I'm working on for Current Affairs is lessons from James Baldwin for the FIRE sector. So FIRE, of course, is finance, insurance. Oh, let's see, am I going to get the acronym right? Finance, insurance, and real estate. So the FIRE sector includes that kind of group of financial industries. And, one of James Baldwin's really kind of well-known books is The Fire Next Time. And so using that play on words to speak finance, insurance, and real estate industries. I mean, so much of what James Baldwin writes about, he has really kind of expansive writing. He will start out on one topic. So James Baldwin has this really famous quote that folks often use to point to banks, to critique banks, and that is, "I attest to this, the world is not white. It was never white, cannot be white. White is a metaphor for power, and that is simply a way of describing Chase Manhattan Bank." So he has this expansive way of writing and then slipping in a reference to a bank or to an insurance company kind of across his work. And so I wanted to be able to, just really read and spend time with kind of the lessons that James Baldwin has, related to banking and finance and a racial capitalist economy, and speak about those connections. One of the things about James Baldwin's life, kind of connecting to this idea of digital technology and financial technology, won't save a broken system. It's pretty well known that Baldwin is surveilled pretty heavily by the FBI across his career, as many Black activists were at that time. And one of the things that, we learned from Baldwin's FBI files is that they report how he's consistently denied credit. So the FBI is tracking and surveilling his work and who he is, as well as, surveilling his sexuality, gay as a queer man. They're, trying to figure out how to code his marital status or how his relationship status is something that they're tracking, alongside noting how he's denied a Diners Club early credit card. He's denied financing for one of his plays and has to, go around and fundraise to keep his play open. The lender decides that despite his international reputation and renown, he does not have the credential, in this case, I think the credential of whiteness that allows him the loan to be able to keep his play open without other sorts of fundraising, efforts. And so this has surveillance, which I think ties to the ways that the state, is surveilling queer and trans people now, different places, especially trans folks, maybe taking names and lists and, keeping track of people's movements and whereabouts. So that's a function of technology, as well as these connections to credit and to money and to the economy.
Well, people can look for the piece upcoming in the print edition of Current Affairs. Professor Terri Friedline, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. That was great.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.